welcome to everyone to our first panel here for the Shippensburg University chapter of the Worldwide Teach-In on Climate Change and Climate Justice. So here we are today, and on this day, on nearly every continent, actually every continent where people live, we have communities coming together at schools, universities, and at faith groups to hold these panels, these teach-in moments on climate change. And this is the first of 3 that we have today. I'm very excited to introduce 3 faculty members here at Shippensburg University who are going to help us broaden our understanding of how injustices and inequalities that affect our society intersect with the problems of climate change. And I was thinking about the way to introduce this, and I was reminded of a quote by one of our literary prophets, William Gibson, to paraphrase, climate change is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed yet. And that is apparently true geographically, right? We know that climate change is geographically different, but it also is structured by the inequalities of our society, whether those are gender inequalities or racial inequalities, or ableism and other problems that we have in our society, both social and structural. And so we have a great diversity here of faculty perspectives to give us expertise on that. And so I don't want to steal their thunder anymore. I want to pass it off to our great panelists here. Dr. Campbell, why don't we start with you if you don't mind? Sure. Why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Sure.
Excellent.
Just introductions and then go into.
Yes, please introduce yourself and then go right ahead.
Okay, so I'm Dr. Jamonn Campbell from the Department of Psychology at Shippensburg University. I'm a social psychologist and I teach a course in the psychology of prejudice and discrimination. And so for my part, I wanted to focus on what's known as environmental racism. Right. So environmental racism is basically just another form of systemic racism, right? So when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the racism that operates, under the surface, behind the curtain, oftentimes that we don't necessarily see or recognize as racism. When we talk about environmental racism, we're talking about how traditionally people of color in the United States and in somewhat globally are more impacted by climate issues, climate change, environmental issues. And what it boils down to, and why we call it a systemic issue, is because it deals with the lack of power and access to things like clean air, clean water, the technology and money, the ability to change one's situation and to make the changes necessary so that these negative environmental impacts aren't affecting oneself and one's community. So we're really talking about unequal access to our basic needs, unequal access to clean environments, unequal access primarily due to race. And that's where the environmental racism comes in. When you think about things like, historically, urban planning and the design of cities, who makes the decisions about where we dispose of toxic chemicals, right? So Pennsylvania is a big fracking state. That water that's used, or that runoff that's used from that fracking process has to be stored somewhere. Who decides where that water gets stored, right? Who decides where to dump, waste and byproducts? Who decides where do we build warehouses and if we're building new highways, if we're having new trucking depots, where do those places go? And primarily, people of color have been the ones who have bared the burden with taking on those environmental changes and issues. And so the effects that we're seeing, due to climate change, due to just direct breathing in, those particles in the air, or drinking that tainted water, or that runoff going into your wells and water tables and things like that, climate change tends to affect and is felt most and first primarily by the people who are most vulnerable and the people who have less options and less resources, right? If we go back, a few decades ago to Hurricane Katrina, I think that's when many of these issues first became more public, when we saw how the Black people who lived in New Orleans, those communities were hit the hardest by Hurricane Katrina. They were unable to leave their homes because they had nowhere to go or they had no transportation. And all of their communities were built, close to those levees and in those floodplains. And that's by no accident, right? That's by design. We see this over and over again in cities across the United States and cities across the globe, where the communities that are put at most risk should a natural disaster happen are communities of color. And that has to do a lot with, like I said, who's in charge and who makes these decisions, who has a voice in these decisions, who can advocate for themselves. And so what we see is the direct impact on these individuals' health and their productivity. When you see places like in Bronx, New York, which this neighborhood that's given the nickname of Asthma Alley, because of the high rates of asthma in this community, in this area. And it's directly due to all these warehouses being built and 5 different highways intersecting in these shipping lanes. And it has the worst air quality in almost the entire United States. And 97% of the population who lives in this asthma alley are Black and Hispanic individuals, right? And they've historically lived there, and companies have historically built these sites, and we know there's an issue. The rates of asthma, childhood asthma, and hospitalizations due to asthma in this area in Bronx, New York, is 5 times higher for people who live in that community than any other area in New York, any of the other boroughs in New York. 5 times higher rates of hospitalization for kids because of the poor air quality in that situation, right? So we're seeing these health risks. We're seeing higher mortality rates. We're seeing people of color suffer from higher rates of asthma, higher blood pressure. The COVID pandemic, we're starting to now recognize and realize some of the unequal impact of COVID and the higher death rates that people of color experienced throughout that process as well. The other thing that we see in terms of environmental racism is, the difference between who's responsible for it and who bears the brunt of it, right? And so we see this huge gap between people who are causing the pollution and people who are exposed to that pollution. For example, people of color in the United States breathe in 60% more pollution than they are responsible for causing, right? So that seems really unbalanced, right? Really unequal, right? If I'm not responsible for this pollution, why am I breathing in so much? Compared to whites in the United States, they take in 17% less polluted air than they are contributing. And it's primarily due, again, to socialization issues. Whites typically are more of the consumers of things that may be responsible for pollution. If you just look at things like car ownership and who's driving. In New Orleans, for example, 30% of the Black households didn't have cars, weren't driving cars, right? Compared to only 5% of the white households. It's one of the reasons why they couldn't evacuate when the evacuation orders were given, but also on a daily basis. If you don't have a car, you're either walking to work, you're commuting to work, or you're using public transportation. All things that are reducing your carbon footprint and your contributions to global warming and climate change. So they're causing less pollution, but they're bearing the brunt of other people's pollution, essentially. And that's again a huge gap. The other thing that we see in terms of inequality between people of color and whites in our society, research has found that white communities are more likely to actually benefit from natural disasters and problems due to climate change and the climate crisis, right, compared to Black communities. So how could white communities benefit from climate crisis and climate change and natural disasters? Well, when natural disasters happen, usually white communities are the first ones that receive the money, the grants, the efforts to rebuild them. And so research has found actually when a natural disaster like a flood or something happens in a primarily white community, those communities actually increase in wealth because they get an influx of money, whereas the Black communities tend to decrease because it takes longer for them to rebuild. If they're ever able to rebuild, they're never able to regain that equity that comes back again. And so even though a lot of these structural issues and problems have happened because of previous overt racism that created things like, ghettos and disadvantaged areas, we're still seeing a lot of these practices continue today in how we make decisions about environmental concerns. And a lot of times those decisions are still either consciously or unconsciously made based on, race-related issues.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. And now why don't we now turn to Dr. Carrie Sipes.
Hi, welcome everyone. So yeah, I'm Carrie Sipes from the Communication Journalism and Media Department. I'll be talking to you for the next 10 minutes about news deserts and their effects on the topic of climate and how the lack of access to information is a real climate issue. So I do have some graphs that I'll be putting up. So if you like maps and you like graphics, I have some visuals for you today. The concept actually of a news desert emerged from an article that Laura Washington wrote in 2011. And academics have been looking at this concept for about the last 10 years. And journalists too, right? Journalists are very interested in which communities are getting coverage, obviously the changes that we've seen in journalism and the newsroom, and the closure of lots of small papers and things have had a tremendous effect. So I'm going to talk about some of those issues. And similar to what Dr. Campbell was saying, of course, different communities have different effects in how much they've been impacted by these loss of local media. So real briefly, if we go back to Laura Washington's article, and if you want to look it up, I'm always about primary sources. So if you'd like to look it up, it's called The Paradox of Media Age and What to Do About It. It was written about 10 years ago. But this concept of a news desert actually emerged from a Chicago South Side community organizer who was participating in a research study that was looking at assessing the news needs of low income and minority communities in the South and West sides of Chicago neighborhoods and of those regions. And what they found was one particular person said, I'm basically living in a communications desert. I'm living in the city, but I'm basically living in a communications desert. And this is a quote from her. She said, we keep talking about the bad stuff. We don't talk about what's good that's going on out in our communities. And this concept of this communications desert then led people to think about, well, really, this is like a news desert issue where you're not getting information. So definitions vary, but real briefly, most news desert definitions say that it's a geographic area of people that don't have access to quality, reliable, local, accessible information. So just to give you a real definition that comes from the Center for Innovation and Sustainability in Local Media from UNC. It's a great resource. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you look up USA News Deserts. And they have all kind of interactive maps where you can see where these things are happening. And in many cases, you can overlay this with, and I'd actually like to look into this further with some of the other poverty numbers. And if you look at where different communities are living, and if you overlay that with other demographic details, you can actually see where these news deserts are disparate, having a disparate impact on those communities. So the Center for Innovation and Sustainability defines these news deserts as communities that are rural or urban with limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds our democracy at the grassroots level. So If you want to go to the next slide, next one, here's a map of what the current state of news deserts look like in the United States. So the red constitutes where there are no local newspapers, and the yellow says that there are one. So there's very little competition in many, many communities for news and information. We saw this as a problem in the pandemic when you're depending on local information that's timely, that's going to affect communities. And we can see the same problem that's going to be brewing as we start to see more and more climate issues popping up, because as Russ said at the beginning, right, like it's just not affecting everybody yet, but that will be coming. So I think that if you take a look at where we're looking at these news deserts across the United States, there are places that regionally speaking have serious and so you can see that we have 2 counties in our state that don't have any newspaper, no local news outlet. And we have a bunch, 18 counties that just have a single. One of the issues that comes up with this is, you know, competition among news makes for better news coverage, right? And if you only have one media outlet that's covering something, first of all, you're going to have a limited staff. You're not going to have enough people power to go out and actually cover all of those events and actually get to know the community members, which builds trust. So then you start to get into an area where you don't know any of the reporters, your community doesn't talk to them, they don't know them, they don't trust them. And so then the information becomes in question as well. But Pennsylvania, all in all, has, you know, 2 areas, 2 counties that just don't have a very good news coverage here with no newspapers. And then we do have a bunch that are in that struggling category, if you will, where there's just not a lot of competition for information. If you can hit the next slide. So just a few stats for you, if you like numbers. So half of all of our counties in the United States, so about 1,528, have only one newspaper, and that's usually a weekly. This is coming from the UNC databases. Weekly newspapers, I don't know if you've ever looked at those. They're not usually investigative. They're not usually really hard-hitting kinds of news. They're very small newsrooms, again, and they're just not able to cover the community the way that they would want to if they were properly resourced. So we're saying that half of the counties don't even have that, which is a real concern. Number 2 on my list is more than a quarter of the country's newspapers have disappeared, 25%. So you're looking at vast news deserts across our country, which has implications not only for our climate topic for today, but also just, you know, for democracy at a whole, whenever you have a lack of access to quality information at the local level, because the local level is where the action happens, right? That's where you can affect change. That's where you can come up with solutions that work for your community versus a top-down approach. But I want to make it clear that these news deserts don't just affect like one particular area, right? There are rural areas that are really hard hit by news deserts, and I'll talk about that in a second. Since we live in a rural area here, like Shippensburg is in a rural area, but it also is a hard hit to urban communities as well as suburban communities now, because a lot of people who are living in suburbia don't have access to a local paper that covers things that are going on in their area. If they're outside of a large metro area, the only thing that gets covered is that large metro area. Number 3 on my list is just to put it in perspective, where we've lost this information and the effect that we could have, or the negative effects that this could have on us, I think is important. At least 1,800 communities that had a local news outlet in 2004 do not have one today. 1,800 communities. So if you think about that, if we're trying to get people on board with, here are climate issues that your community needs to deal with, we literally have such vast news gaps and information coverage gaps that becomes even more just practically difficult to do. And lastly, more than 200 counties in the US have 0 newspaper or credible source. So if you can go to the next slide, who's most affected? Of course, the effects of this are not equally distributed. So what we see is rural and urban communities, especially minority communities, and those from low income are more disadvantaged in this area. And we've seen more and more of these news deserts occurring in those places. So rural and urban, and especially impoverished communities. So if you go to the next slide, you can take a look at some of the demographic profiles of counties that don't have newspapers. They tend to have a higher poverty rate. They tend to have fewer college degrees, and their median income is lower. So if you think about some of the effects of this, and if we're trying to get people to be interested in this topic, number one, there's just a lack of information, generally speaking, and number two, people who don't have resources to actually, affect some of these, implement some of these changes that we might be suggested is another major problem. You go ahead to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that different regions of our country are disproportionately affected by this. And you can see one area of the country stands out, and all of this comes from the UNC. So if you want to really dive into that USA News Deserts, that's their research. But you'll see that the South has, every single state in the South has at least one county that doesn't have a newspaper. And you can see just by the numbers here on the graph how much more affected people are in those regions about this problem. Go to the next slide. So one shining spot that we can point to that has made, I think, positive effects is the ethnic media press. So while they still have the same struggles, right? Like subscription rates are down, there's like budget problems and the lack of access to like legacy funding sources, right? Because they've always been much more independent and advocacy related. But what we're seeing is, especially in Spanish language media outlets, the growth of independently owned media. And so as the Hispanic populations in the United States are increasing, we're seeing increase in the numbers of independent media that are Spanish language, Hispanic focused. And so we have seen a positive trend in that over the last 20 years, where we've seen a major decrease on pretty much every other independently owned media source. One thing that they're doing well, but that is related to one of the many things that they're doing well that's related to our topic, is giving relevant and meaningful news to their communities, right? Because they are understanding what the wants, interests, and needs are of that community, and they're able to get out and do that, which I think for us on the climate issue, it's those relationships, right, that are going to make a difference. And it's the conversations that you have with that local leader. It's about finding new ways to engage those audiences. And so one thing that Laura Washington's article mentions, she gives, I think, 5 things, and this was 10 years ago, right? So we've been talking about like, what can we do for 10 years? But, we need to have even more action on this topic, even though some work has already been done. But one of the things that she suggests in that article is focusing on more positive stories to build those relationships. Also, just having different ways of communicating with those communities. Could information about these important topics like climate, resilience, and adaptation, could that be part of community blogs that you have, people that you've partnered with? Could this even be part of church bulletins and other ways that people might be interacting with people that they trust? All right, next slide. Here's just a map of where the ethnic media are in the United States. You can see that there are some pretty big gaps of lack of ethnic media outlets as well in here, but I think the visual is helpful. All right, I have I think one more slide to go, maybe 2. So what are the results of these news deserts and implications for climate resilience and adaptation? Well, one thing that happens whenever you lose local media is there's less government accountability and oversight. So if you look at research, you'll see that, hey, guess what happens? Budgets all of a sudden start to go up in your community. You're paying for your elected officials to get more money, or budgets start to bloat whenever you don't have that government oversight through the journalism. Number 2, mis and disinformation spread quickly and are difficult to counter, right? It's easy to get onto social media and get all kinds of mis or disinformation. And if you don't have that counter of here's fact-based, vetted sources, here are all of these things that we can prove to you to look into further even, that starts to be a real issue for us from the climate perspective. If we look to see as a case study even what's happened with COVID-19 and learn lessons from that to apply in this case, I think that that's very prudent. And last, there's a disconnect between metro areas that have significant coverage and then those urban and rural communities that don't have the coverage, right? So you might have people who are living in these larger cities who might be getting information that's high quality, that's vetted, that's researched, that has gone through that editorial process, and then they may have a different perspective of the climate resilience and adaptation efforts versus that maybe that news desert community or communities, because they're just not getting the same kind of quality information. And then of course we see that rural urban divide or metro versus disadvantaged community within that metro area as well. So I don't want to end on a bad note, right? So what can we do about this problem related to climate? So the last slide is what can be done. Obviously, we can focus on positive stories that communities are already doing, right? Many communities are already seeing these problems, whether it's the aftermath of a hurricane, the aftermath of some other kind of, I know we've had tornadoes lately in New Orleans again. That what are the positive stories that people are doing to address these things on their own? Number two is to develop new ways to engage and inform communities that have little to no local media coverage. Sometimes this is as simple as a texting club. So a lot of journalists now are having texting clubs so that you can get information. You can actually be part of the journalistic process, which I think will help to build trust over time. And lastly, looking for partners that have similar missions and values. So Climate Solutions is an organization that our department is partnered with. They'll actually have a representative here tonight. So if you're coming back to the 7 p.m. session, shameless pitch, come back to that. You know, you can talk with Scott Blanchard from WITF, and he works with State Impact PA as well. But looking for partners who are able to partner with you to accomplish the missions that you have, to engage with communities in rural, in news desert areas, in urban areas, to talk with new people and to really, I think, get the conversation started about what solutions they see that they can move forward with. It's about getting that grassroots information out and started so that we can start to solve these problems together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sipes. That was excellent and really informative. And I want to now turn to our last, but certainly not least, panelist, Dr. Flagler. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I really loved what Carrie said about reporting the news and including everybody in the reporting. And I am here today to talk about, or to make the case for including people with disabilities in the discussion about climate change. My two areas of interest are human rights and disabilities. And I have noticed in the last, I would say, 3-4 years, that there is a very strong interest among the disability community about climate change, the policies that affect climate change, the international treaties that affect the climate change. And the reason is very clear. In this world, 15%, some say 20%, but I will go with 15% of the people are recognized to have a disability. In numbers, that is 1 billion. That's a big number of people. And what is happening now is two things. Number one, people with disabilities are the most vulnerable, and I will give you a couple of examples. And they are also the most overlooked population when it comes to addressing the effects of climate change. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of research yet to have facts. So there are a lot of reports that have tried to capture the phenomenon. So I will be referring to these reports, to first-person accounts of what is happening. Why a human rights approach? Because for people with disabilities, like everybody else, climate change brings changes to their basic quality of life in various areas. And all of these areas are part of the rights that people with disabilities enjoy, either through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or there is a convention, the Convention on the Rights of People, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that specifies these rights. And there is the intersection of race, of gender, and social and economic status. So even among the people with disabilities, the impact on their rights because of climate change is not the same. But for the sake of this 10-minute presentation, I will have an overall presentation without making note of the intersections. So what does climate change bring to disability? Number one, it enhances inequality, inequality in nutrition, inequality in healthcare, and I'm only mentioning two of many other inequalities. And what happens is many conditions that can be treated become untreatable and become disabilities. So the number of people with disabilities in the world increases. If there is a disaster, people have limited access to necessary resources and services. And that very often includes life-sustaining care. What is the result? People who don't get that care get chronic conditions that become disabilities. So this is where it starts. But then when we have a disaster, what happens to the people with disabilities? According to the United Nations Environment Program, people with disabilities are more at risk in the case of disasters due to a lack of access to education and information, existing health conditions, and difficulty evacuating safely. So let me give you a couple of examples. Extreme heat, which is connected with climate change. So many members of the disability community are especially vulnerable to extreme heat because of the inability of their body to cool off. So if you have multiple sclerosis and you are not in an air-conditioned setting, too bad. Your situation will become such that you lose the ability to meet the demands of everyday life. Hurricanes. And I know that somebody might become technical and say that climate change does not cause hurricanes, but the hotter surface water temperatures make the hurricanes stronger. So I have learned this thing. Anyhow, imagine a hurricane. People with disabilities need early access to shelter, social supports, medical assistance as needed. What happens when that is missing? Because no planning has been done for people with disabilities. Then we have the disaster of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. People over the age of 75, so older adults with disabilities, were those that experienced death in nursing homes. Then we go to another situation in Puerto Rico. Remember, there was no electricity for about 2 months. What happens if you have to live on life support that requires electricity? We don't have numbers, but the reports are that many people who could have had a longer life passed away. Floods. And the examples that we'll give to you are from other parts of the world to show that this is a problem everywhere. In 2019, when Western Germany was hit with floods, 12 residents died at a care facility for those with disabilities. In July 2020, 14 people died in a nursing home in Kuma, Japan, during a flood because they were not evacuated, because there were no plans for people with disabilities to be evacuated. So we go to droughts. Well, besides the food insecurity and the heat, what do we have? We have increased incidence of mental health issues. So people who have mental health issues get into a more severe condition, and they saw it in New Zealand. And then many new people experience mental health. And because resources become smaller in this situation, you don't even have the expertise necessary to help people with these mental health issues. I was at the conference and I had heard the presentations of two mental health professionals, and they were talking about an epidemic that will have a long-lasting effect. Fires. And the example will be from California. So what happens when there is a fire? First, people with disabilities that don't have a strong support network might not receive the help they need to get out. And then, because those that are lucky, they might lose wheelchairs, scooters, walkers, canes, hearing aids, communication devices, which for them are means of survival. Displacement. When we talk about the climate refugees, what happens in this case? People with disabilities that live in a certain community, that have got all the connections and the support of the social network, lose it in a moment because they have to go to a new community where there are no resources planned for them. And they also lose the social network that provided the support. For those that choose to stay, guess what? The resources dwindle. So the people don't get the care they need to enjoy their freedoms and their rights. Emergency management. What they have found is that emergency management practices are not very inclusive. Not all organizations factor in people with disabilities when they make these plans. And if people with disabilities are not in the plans, then what happens during the crisis? So, as you see, there is a very good connection here of climate change and disability rights. And as I told you, the disability rights activists are really trying to tackle two issues. The first issue is climate change, which is still not as visible as it should be. And people with disabilities in this context, which is totally invisible. And a mantra of the disability community is nothing about us without us. And there is an organization called Sustainability that has been very successful. It's a disability-led network with grassroots movements. They have been able to secure a place at the table during the conference of the parties for the United Nations Conventions on Climate Change. And through promoting this conversation with disability organizations, people have become very creative. For example, there is an organization in Germany, and what they do is they do climate theater. So they have plays which show how people with disabilities are affected in order to bring people with disabilities in the conversation about climate change. Thank you.
Okay, let's give up for a minute here. And well, that was just a really excellent and diverse range of perspectives from our faculty experts here on different ways in which inequalities structure the problem of climate justice. And now I think looking at the time, I think what I'd like to do is open up opportunities for questions, and then we can turn back to our panelists for more comments after we've solicited questions. So Claire, do we have any questions from Zoom? Why don't we look there first?
We do not have any questions on Zoom. If you are joining via Zoom, please just use the Q&A and feel free to share any questions or comments and we'll get to you.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll hopefully get some in from our Zoom audience, but let's turn to our audience here in Grove Forum. Do we have questions for our panelists about what they've talked about or about other issues that you think connect with this issue of climate justice? Yeah.
Just had a real, I guess, basic technical question for Dr. Sipes. On the news desert measures, were those measuring like actual physical newspapers, or did it also include like, papers that just were online only?
Yeah, they measure digital. That study looks at digital and traditional print media outlets. And what we've seen is that while digital has definitely increased, if you look at some of their other data, like the trajectory for digital is this, and print is the opposite. But what we don't see is the similar impact, right? So people paid for subscriptions, right? But they don't want to pay for digital. So then the newsrooms can't really cover the way that they would have. So digital is a potential solution to these problems, but they still have to have funding sources. And that's, I think, the challenge, the business challenge for that.
And that goes back to some of the stuff I've been hearing about too, in terms of getting through the clutter and misinformation that's out there. Even with just the digital sites, so many of them now have these paywalls up. So you can't even read, it's a good source, right? So it's a good source. I know it's verified. I'm trying to read the information, but I have to pay in order to access it. So I get the title, I get the first sentence, and then I can't get the rest of the content. But all the disinformation and misinformation sources out there are completely free, completely wide open, more easy to access those types of information. So I think that's even becoming a problem too. I mean, even if there is news sources in your town, still, I either have to pay for a subscription to get the physical copy, or I got to pay for the online copy that used to be free and accessible to everyone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of calls for people to have a different funding mechanism for journalism, because it is such a fundamental thing that we need in our society. So some people have called for even more like governmental funding of that, which creates other issues, right? Because you want to have separation of those things,
Yeah.
But that's one solution. Others are large foundations funding those, but you do want to keep, again, all of these things that are like potential solutions are also potential hazards. So, but I completely get that. Yeah, we don't want free bad information and paid for good information. We need to find the way to have more free access to the high quality information, so people can verify or fact check or look for multiple sources of information.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm just gonna wait until other people ask questions, but so again, a shameless plug. The Department of Geography and Neurosciences offer quite a number of different courses, and one of those courses coming up this summer is called Coastal Hazards and Sustainability, and it's a 2-week online with 1 week face-to-face down at the coast of Virginia, where we actually really do kind of look at actually all 3 of these elements that you mentioned. If we think about the effect of sea level rise on the eastern shore of Virginia, I mean, that's a big part of our food system. If you've heard about Tyson or Purdue, right, they're major, but they have these historically underrepresented populations, very significant disability population on the eastern shore, obviously African American and Hispanic American population. So when we think about the effects of climate change, in particular sea level rise, coastal subsidence, pollution, this is a community that sees all of these rich people, right, coming down to the eastern shore to party up on the beach, right, and then they zoom right back to their homes, and there's no understanding of the life that is lived and is faced by folks on the shore. So I want to make sure that folks know that that's a really fun way to explore this. It's a 190 class. It's a Gen Ed Category C course. But I guess my question to the panel is, when you think about these topics like this, I just sort of see this big intersectionality between each of your different disciplines. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, we think about this thing, sustainability, and about the stewardship of our communities, what role do you think everyday people have, right? And how can we advance, our understanding of sustainability so that people take action?
Well, I can go first. I mean, I think one of the good things that come from, sessions like this, and when we take time out and we have, weeks dedicated to this, it is increasing that knowledge and awareness. I mean, a lot of times that we get so caught up in our own area that we don't understand. And so it's great. I love hearing the stuff from my colleagues up here, because it's some of the things I don't even consider because I just get locked into my own perspective. We tend to live in our own bubbles, our academic bubbles or our social bubbles or our work bubbles, and oftentimes don't get to hear those stories from people who are different from us, who live in different areas from us. So we might not even recognize the other issues that are out there. So events like this and just exposure to information and newspapers and hearing those stories, I think are a first important step. And then it's starting to understand, okay, what do I need to do? Right? Here's a problem. I see it on a wider scale. I see it on a micro scale. I see it in my life. What are some of the steps that I can take? And I think one of the things that, and maybe this has to do a little bit with psychology, when the problem seems so big and so overwhelming, it's almost paralyzing. And so we tend to just think that, well, nothing I do is going to matter, right? The problem's too big. We're talking about, holes in the ozone layer. We're talking about rising sea levels. We're talking about ice shelves collapsing. We're talking about air pollution. And it just seems so massive that nothing I do matters. I was talking to this with my students in one of my classes a couple of days ago about how, little changes, to borrow from Malcolm Gladwell, little changes can have big effects. It doesn't take, massive efforts are great. Billions of dollars of funding are great. But if we can make small changes, and enough people make small changes in their daily routine, in daily lives, you see this dramatic impact. It may not be immediate, but within 5-10 years, when we started targeting and cutting out CFCs in aerosol sprays, right? Everyone I'm going to date myself, in the 80s with, spray-on deodorants and those types of things that were just common. Everyone just used them, sprays on. And we started to recognize, okay, we shouldn't be using those. There's other alternatives. We can use roll-on, we can use other things. And pretty soon, everyone just stopped using, well, not everyone, but a lot of people stopped using them. And within a few years, we started to see, the holes in the ozone layer start to shrink because we knew the problem. We got enough people to take some easy steps. Okay, instead of this deodorant, I'm going to use this one. Instead of buying an aerosol spray, I'm going to use, something else. One small little meaningful change, but enough people take it, and it can have a huge impact. And that's what we don't recognize. Same thing with, the reverse happens too. The little things that I do to contribute to these climate issues, even though they may seem small and meaningless, have a big ripple impact. They may not affect me, right? The fact I'm brushing my teeth and I'm leaving the water run for 2 minutes while I'm brushing my teeth, that's not going to affect me, right? Central PA isn't really experiencing any droughts, that's going to meaningfully impact us. But me leaving that water running for 2 minutes is going to have impact on other people, right? Either in the United States, in the Midwest, or out in California, and even in other countries, as the water table starts to decrease and decrease. That's what I think we need to realize, that the small steps, the small changes are all it takes, one way or the other. Stop doing the negative things and start doing the positive things just on a daily basis, make it a habit, and we can start to see those ripple effects.
I guess real briefly, I would add that it's about not doing things the way we've always done, from a communications perspective, right? So we're not going to have journalists sitting in a newsroom deciding what they think that community needs to know about whatever. They're going to get out into the community, talk to more people, get to know more people, ask them, hey, what's going on here, so that they can even understand what stories they should be, looking into further. So I think it's about like a shift in, I'm an expert in how to do this, you're the expert in your experience, right? And so I'm gonna so I think that the interactions are gonna be different. I think as journalism tries to shift and figure out like, hey, what's the model that's going to work for us in the future? And I think it is about partnering and doing things differently and partnering with community groups that are doing the good work. And maybe it's not like advocating, right? Because journalism isn't supposed to advocate for one thing or another, but it is about like highlighting like, hey, what's going on in this community that's really working well that we can then share. This is called solutions journalism. And it's a different focus from reporting on what has happened that's bad or whatever, and crime and all those other things. It's more about, hey, what's working in these communities and can we tell stories about what's working? So I read this story that happened in a community similar to mine in another state. Now I have ideas that I can push forward in my own area. So I think there's a shift going on like that, at least in some newsrooms.
In social work, the environmental social work is a very rapidly growing area. And we have infused content connected to environmental racism and climate change in our classes. And when I teach research with undergraduate students for a couple of years, our topic has been environmental social work education. And what I have heard from students is that even with one brief lecture and reading one or two articles, their attitude changes. So the focus should be on education. And when I ask them for creative ideas of what we can do, what students offer is, why don't we talk about these things from the primary school, and then with students in middle school and students in high school? And why don't we make environmental education, for lack of a better term, a class that is required to all students? Because if we need to take care of the earth, especially, again, it's a question of human rights, it's the earth that we will be leaving to the other generations. So then we all have to play our part as citizens, but we need education to do that. So these are some of the ideas that my students have given to me.
Do we have other questions? We have questions from Zoom?
No questions from Zoom.
We have a question up here. All right, excellent.
Let me bring the mic up to you.
So my question is going back to like the small things that we can do to help the environment. So as college students, what are some examples of those like small things that we can do to save the environment and really help out?
Well, thinking about the commuter survey, if you live close enough to campus, ride your bike to campus instead of drive your car 5 minutes and park it here. I think that is something that's doable. I mean, obviously that might not work all the time for every situation if you have to run to work after or whatever, but I think when you can, like if that's an option, that's a simple thing that you can do. I know I've heard some of my students even talking about that recently, so.
And one thing I'd like to see more from students, and it's not, maybe anything daily or small, but I think when you are thinking about what career path you want to take and what jobs you want to take and who you want to support, start thinking about climate issues in terms of those decisions as well. We talk about our engineering majors. There are tons and tons of green focused jobs out there. And those careers are growing. They're booming. They need more people, but we typically have this standard mindset about what type of career, what type of job I'm going to go to. When you talk about research on solar panels and solar installation and insulating homes better, the huge industry coming now is battery development, research in renewable energy and batteries. And so all those things, think about those. And, when you're going out and looking for careers, who do I want to support? What types of jobs am I passionate about? I think those are huge decisions because, you all are going to be the ones who are living here long after we're gone, right? You all are going to be the ones that I apologize, we're leaving you with a mess, right? We're leaving your kids with a mess. But if we shift our focus from, those traditional career paths, those traditional ones, and focus on those green issues, and when we make those decisions, when we make any decision, think about the impact that it's going to have on climate, even if it doesn't seem like, this isn't really going to matter very much, but I guarantee it's related to everything that we do. So that's what I would, suggest to students essentially. Think about it in terms of your futures and what you can do.
Marita, do you have anything you want to add there?
I will have like an anecdote.
Great.
There is a funny exercise that you can do on the internet when you put how you use resources, and then you calculate how many worlds you would need if everybody lived like you. I come from Albania, which is a poor country. So I consider myself to be very thrifty. As I was doing it, I said, for me, it will be even half a world. Surprise, surprise. I need a world and a half.
Which is really good for living in the US, actually. Yeah.
Yes, but I think if we have these conversations with people and we have these conversations with students, and you become aware of your consumption pattern, that might help in building a different pattern.
I guess one last thing that I wanted to mention was some of the other effects of having these news deserts is we see differences in voting patterns. We see differences in volunteerism, in being connected to the community, and in all of these other things. And so I think that as you go out and you're living in the communities, wherever that may be in the future, about being involved. I think that it's important that as a college graduate, you are involved in your local community as a way to give back and to pay it forward to others. Because in these communities where there are news deserts, I think that they are really needing people to step up and to find those ways that they can make those connections and to have information sharing. And all of you being in a college program is more than prepared to do that kind of work. So I think there are real practical steps you can take even as you leave.
Yeah, and I will just add as we wrap up here, that community piece, I think, is something that's spanned across all three of our panelists, whether it's the problem of environmental racism, the problem of the challenges faced by people with disabilities, or the problem of news deserts, is the problem of atomization. So being a part of a community, it goes a long way, right? It's not just the big structural things, though we need those too. And I'd like to also point out that so much of what we talked about here is not related to, on its face, sustainability or the problem of climate change. But when you work to expand access to news, when you will work to expand justice and equality for people with disabilities, when you work to end structural problems of racism and environmental racism, you are working to solve the problem of climate change. That is the reason why we're talking about this all day today, and all around the world we're talking about this. It doesn't have to just be about batteries, though batteries are so important, right? And Jamonn, I'm so glad that you brought that up, right? There's so much work directly there, but any work that you do as a graduate of this university is going to be work to help solve climate change, if you keep in mind that you're working toward that goal. And I see that we're at time, right? So I think I have 30 seconds. So I'll just say thank you very much. Our next panel is at 3 p.m. It will be in this room and also on the interwebs through Zoom. So please follow that link. We have a really great discussion from Environmental Law Center lawyers working on environmental justice in the Southwest. So I really hope you'll be able to join us for that. Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists.